Hey, I want to show you a bit about stitch markers today. So these are the stitch markers I'm using. I actually make these. You can find a link to my shop where you can purchase some in the notes below. So they are, the bead is captive, it's stuck there, and they're solid metal rings, which is great. So stitch markers are useful in a bunch of situations. Mostly they remind you where to do stuff differently. So like you'd have stitch markers along a line where you change stitch patterns, like here. So I've got stuck in it between, stitch markers and then garter on the edges. So I would put a stitch marker on my right hand needle like this, and it can rattle around and that's fine, but it's not anchored until you work the next stitch. So when you knit that next stitch, then it's stuck. Then it's not going anywhere. So the reason why I really like these stitch markers, I have some that are dangly. Sometimes I like to use them, but the dangly ones can be a little tricky for beginners because when you're working a knit or a purl, sometimes you have to treat the stitch marker a little differently. For instance, when I get to this one, I would just slip it over from one side to the other. And in fact, these ones are substantially bigger, so you can kind of just like push on it and it makes an opening that's easy to grab. But when the stitch marker is closer in size to the needle, this little bead can be really helpful just to give you something to push against, to push it over onto the other needle. Ones that are dangly, stitch markers that are dangly, can get caught up in your yarn. So for instance, say if I had this one and it was dangly, in between the knit and the purl, I could accidentally catch the dangles when I move my yarn in front to purl, whereas with this one, it doesn't matter where it's sitting, it'll always pop back into place. So as I'm purling across, I'm going to come to another stitch marker. I put some in there just with some yarn over and knit two togethers. And stitch markers can get really weird around yarn overs. So no matter what size the stitch marker is, no matter what style it is, if it's an on the needle type stitch marker, sometimes it likes to pop past your yarn over. So for instance, it's supposed to be on this left side of the yarn over, but all it takes is a little bit of manipulation and suddenly it's on the right side of the yarn over. So sometimes it'll switch even just with you pushing your stitches around on the needles. So you have to be careful when you have a yarn over next to a stitch marker. They like to migrate. So just make sure that you know which side your yarn over is supposed to be on your stitch marker. And then when you come to the stitch marker, you just switch it over to the right hand needle and keep going. I like to pick my stitch markers to accent or complement the knitting that I'm using. I picked these ones, these copper ones, copper on copper, to bring out that little bit of copper in the yarn.